Hi, and welcome to the digital job site where the boards are straight, the weather's great, and there really is a board stretcher. This video is part 2 of a 3-part series that I'm calling Model and Measure Demystifying Hip Roof Framing. And this part 2 video will show how to create the rafters that you see in this model and rafters similar to that. If you had a chance to see part 1, which was Model and Measure Demystifying Hip Roof Framing by Visualizing in SketchUp, I used this model to discuss the relationship of the various roof framing components, the hip rafter and the jack rafters, common rafters, and how they all relate to each other and why they're cut and installed the way they are. And then part 3, which is I'll try to get done in a week or so, we'll go through the meat of this series, which ultimately is a way to draw a roof like this and then measure the various components with their angles and lengths so that you can use those for pattern layout to cut and frame an actual hip roof. So I hope that makes sense. The text that goes with these videos is at the digital job site blog on finehomebuilding.com. If you navigate over there, you can get more information about the how and why of this video series. So I hope you'll join us over there. But for now, I think we'll just get started and show how to do this to draw rafters. And I'm going to shut off these shadows here to make the model go a little quicker. You'll notice that Bryce got up on the roof with this extension ladder model that somebody named Smart Sizer uploaded to the SketchUp component warehouse. Did a great job of that ladder. If you get a chance, you can download the model, the whole model I have here, and zoom in on this extension ladder and see how great a job was done on that. And I've got Bryce hanging out up there on the roof inspecting his rafter job. Anyways, I've put those things on a layer called decorations, which I'll now hide to keep the model going quicker. If you saw the part 1 video of this, you'll recognize this layers dialog box. And what I'll do, these rafters are all created here. Rather than trace over them, I'll just create new rafters for this video. So I can go into the layers dialog box where I've created and named these various layers. And so I'm just going to hide the hip rafters, and let's hide the jack rafters, get those out of the program. And I've got the fascia on a layer here. You can see it come and go. And I guess I haven't gone through how I created the fascia itself, but it's important to have the fascia in the model so that you can see how the hip rafter is cut for attachment of the fascia here. You can pivot around, you can see that the hip rafter nestles nicely into that 90-degree corner of the fascia. But so I'm going to leave the fascia showing, and I'll just hide that hip rafter. Now I'll just hide that dialog box. And for any hip roof, the main structure prior to installing the hip rafter is the common rafters that make up the basic part of the roof, and then there's one common rafter in the center of the hip on either end, and then the hip structure fills in these corners. And you can see some of that explained and detailed a little bit in part 1 of this video series. But for now, to create a hip rafter, if you remember from the other video, the hip rafter needs to support the plywood sheeting on these intersecting planes of these two roofs. So we need to put a framing member down in between there. And just like cutting a hip rafter, if you ask 10 different carpenters how to cut, you'll get 10 different methods at doing it. Same with modeling and drawing, but I'm just going to show you a method, sequence of commands and a process that I use to create a hip rafter, which I think is pretty efficient. I went through in my mind other options of something that might be quicker and more efficient. I really didn't come up with anything. So I think you'll see this is effective even if it doesn't end up being the way that you do it over time. But this is a pretty effective way to get started on it. So To get started with the process, our hip rafter is going to come into this 90 degree corner at a 45 degree angle. And the way that I've created to do this, I just grab the protractor tool here, and then once it's on this horizontal plane, I'm going to hold the shift key down to keep that protractor from flipping all over the place. And then I'll just click on the red axis and drag over here until I get a 45 degree angle. And you can see down here in the value control box it shows that I ended up with a 45 degree line. And the hip rafter in this case is going to be 1.5 inches thick. So I'm just going to draw from this corner out on this 45 degree line and type in 1.5 so that you get that line will be the basis for 1.5 inches thick roof hip rafter. Now if you're going to use a microlam or some other type of lumber, if you're using beam framing and you had a microlam or LVL lumber and it was 1.75 inches thick, you just draw this line, whatever thickness that your hip rafter is going to be. In this case I'm just assuming a straight or a standard 1.5 inch thick 2x10 is what we're going to end up with. So once I've got that line drawn, I'm going to pick up the line tool and draw in the green direction and the red direction to get a little plane here. And this whole model is set up, I'm going to back up here a little bit, the whole model is set up where all these things that I have in here are grouped geometry of one sort or another, so that when I draw this little surface on here, it's just going to behave by itself. And I am going to actually make a group of it as well. And then we'll go in and edit that group. Make sure I'm editing that group. Right click, edit group. So now I can edit this little guy. And I'm just going to drag this thing up an arbitrary distance. You'll see why that doesn't really matter. And once I click outside that dotted line, it shows it back in the grouped geometry function. So I grabbed this group. Notice how I grab it precisely at the corner. I don't want to just grab it willy-nilly like you would with your hand picking it up. I'm grabbing it by this particular corner because I want to align, oops, kind of zooming around here, getting a little dizzy. I want to line those two corners up there. And once, if I select the geometry at the point that I want to connect, then that's what SketchUp will target it to. So it's a lot easier to position this little wedge precisely at that corner. And all this process is doing is giving me what I'm calling a hinge that we'll use to pivot our hip rafter into place. So that's group geometry. We're not going to mess with that. And if you'll remember, the reason I'm drawing this hinge with a line across here, now I'm drawing a free line on the face of a group. And I'm just going to connect these 2 points. And those 2 points represent, go back up here and get the layers box. And if I put the hip rafters back into play here, you can see that this line that we created represents the precise point where this hip rafter intersects the 2 common rafters on each side. I've gone through the trouble of this little triangle to create that line. So I'll hide the hip rafters. We have the line, and with the line I'm going to draw a rectangle. I grab the rectangle tool here, and what I want this rectangle to do is follow the face of that little wedge that we plopped in there. And it's trying to do all sorts of things, but I want to end up with a rectangle that's the cross section of our hip rafter, which in this case is going to be 9.25 or 9.25 inches, comma 1.5. So that gives us a rectangle. It's a cross section of a 2x10 with the top of it right at our hinge point. This will hopefully it'll make sense as I develop the process. Now I've gone in, taken that little triangle. I'm just going to delete him out of the way, and we've got this rafter, and I'm going to make it a group for now, but not a component. I intend to change that group into a component a little later in the process. So now we have a rectangle. That's the cross section of a 2x10. And I'm just going to drag it out here an arbitrary distance with the board stretcher or the push-pull tool. And then I'm going to go this direction. I'm just going to say 20 feet. 20, and then hit the apostrophe key and you end up with the 20 feet. That should be long enough. So now we have this handy little group that's going to turn into our hip rafter. So we'll leave that our focus there for a minute and recall that these corners of the hip rafter, the two top corners, need to be coplanar with the faces of these common rafters in this plane and the common rafter in that plane. And then they also need to be, those two hip rafter top corners also need to fit and have an identical heel height. Anywhere you measure vertically across this bird's mouth needs to be the identical height at the hip rafter. So I'm just going to pick this, I want to pick this outside corner where the bird's mouth fits to the corner of the sheet. And of course this is a whole lot more precise digitally than it would be with regular OSB sheathing, but we're still going to create our model accurately and then adapt from there. So what I did is I created a layer and I call that a heel height plane. So I'm going to open that layer up so that you can see what I did. And all I did with this layer, it's a group, and you can see that if I slide this vertically by grabbing it and dragging it down in the blue direction, that heel height plane matches the exact perimeter of the sheathing on this little building I've created. So I deleted that example model. So what you can see is that this line right here, this outside line of this group, represents the heel height of these particular rafters. So when we have the hip rafter needs to intersect that same line. So I've just drawn this arbitrary line, and then because when you look straight down on the model, so you pivot around here, the hip rafter is running 45 degrees to the end wall this way and to the side wall this way. I want the hip to plop right down in there. So I'm going to grab the protractor tool and come down onto this little heel height plane. Put the protractor exactly at the corner, click the side line, and I'm going to pivot in that way 45 degrees. Our hip rafter's 1.5 inches thick, so I'm going to come perpendicular to that line, 0.75 or 3/4 of an inch off of that first guideline. Now I'll erase the center guideline and go back in here to show with the existing hip rafters. Watch this point right here where my arrow is. When I put the hip rafters back in, you can see the edge of the hip rafter intersects that exact line. So the heel height right here at this precise point, if I go vertically to the sheathing, it's 6 and about 1/16 of an inch. And if we go over to the common rafter, I'm hitting escape here. I'm going to jump over to the common rafter, click the same point, and measure vertically in the blue direction, and it's the same, approximately 6 and 1/16. If we change the precision of the model by going up into the model info, I'll just go through this. So that 6 and 1/16 is within 1/64 of an inch, or would have given us a different direction, so it's a very precise measurement. But so I wanted to explain what I'm going to do with that rafter next. The rafter needs to intersect this point here, and it needs to hinge on the point we created earlier. So we'll hide that hip rafter, leave this guideline in. Now I select this group, and I'm grabbing the rotate tool, not to be confused with the protractor tool. Once I get the protractor indexed on the face of this hip rafter, I'm going to hold the shift key down so it doesn't jump to any other plane. If I don't do that, it flips and flops around. SketchUp's trying to guess what plane we want to rotate in. So I'll get it on the plane I want, hold down the shift key, and I'm just going to zoom in to the corner of our hinge. You can see how it turns purple there, and then I click. And now it wants, the program wants to know what I want to pivot how far. So I'm just going to swing out on this hip rafter and click the same top line. And now you can see, if I zoom out, you can see that that's pivoting exactly on our little hinge right in here, no matter how I whip this thing around. And I know that I want that line to intersect this guideline here, so I'm just going to click up until I get a little red X, which is the intersection. I'm going to click again, and now it'll leave it there. So we took our 2x10 and pivoted down exactly where it's going to end up. So that's kind of the second step. First step is create the hinge. Second step, we created the board we're going to cut up for a hip rafter. Put it exactly where we wanted it, pivoted it down, and now we're just going to draw the notches in it. Much like if you've seen my videos on regular rafter layout, that's how we created a common rafter, just by drawing lines and then notching it and cutting it for various intersections that it needs to take care of. So, kind of working our way through this process. I'm just double clicking to get into our group. I haven't made this a component yet. So we just want to put some guidelines in here. Let's do this top cut first. I'm in the component edit mode. You can see as I click these surfaces, I can select any particular thing in here. And because our hip rafter needs to be cut to fit precisely into this corner between these two common rafters and the ridge, I'm just going to trace that out. And I need to get, it's jumping around because our model's big and we're really zooming in. Just need to get a red X for an intersection there. And then I want to follow this line. I don't want to go in the red direction. I want to follow that line till I get to that intersection. And then I want to follow this line till I get to this intersection. And that'll be the cut on our rafter. And we also are going to need a plumb cut here. So I'm going to get the end point of that line. And as I draw vertically here, let's see, that's going to mess things up a little bit. Because we pivoted this geometry down, the axes are misaligned. So you can see the blue axis here isn't running straight up and down, it's running perpendicular to our group. So I'm just going to click a plumb line there, that's going up and down in our model. Just going to bring that over onto our group here. That gives me a guideline for this cut. So I'm just going to click the end point, follow that guideline down till it intersects with the bottom edge of the hip. So now we've got the things we need to cut the top of our hip rafter. You'll see how this process works here. So I'm zooming around, staying in the group edit mode. I'm going to throw a couple more guidelines in. And when this rafter gets a bird's mouth, it's going to have a horizontal cut here. So I'm just going to click a nearby horizontal line and then just drop down onto the top of the plate, just like that. Oops, I lost my perspective there. So I go up here and I click the zoom extends tool, and then that shows the whole model, and then I can zoom back in and get reoriented here. And next thing this bird's mouth is going to need is a notch here to clear the wall. So I'm just taking this vertical line, corner of that sheathing, I'm going to put it there. And let's see, I shorten this up a little bit. You'll see why in a second here. Okay, we need to have a cut that is perpendicular to the faces of this hip rafter. So I'm taking the line tool. Now if I click on a corner and drag out, all it does is leave me this little X, which is kind of useless for our purposes here. So I'm going to back up, and when I click the tape measure or the guideline tool. Rather than clicking on the corner, I'm going to get out on this line somewhere so it gives me a parallel line instead of just a point. I'm going to drag this up until it hits the corner of our sheeting, which is in another group. Alright, grab the tape measure tool again, take a parallel line and put it out here. So that'll give us what we need for our bird's mouth. Clicking there and there. Just going to follow this guideline out to this intersection. Oops, I missed it. I think I missed it by a fraction. I'm going to jump back in, pick up that corner, and zoom in to make sure that I get the intersection clicked very nicely. Okay, so that gives us what we need to cut out the bird's mouth. And you'll notice I'm not cutting any of these things out. I'm just putting lines in here. You'll see why as this develops. Now I've grabbed the line tool again, grabbed an arbitrary horizontal line, and put it right at the bottom of the fascia. Shorten that rafter up a little too much because I want this line to go from the top of the hip rafter to the bottom. This would be the horizontal cut at the heel that accommodates the fascia. Let's see, so the next thing we need is the notch for the inside of the fascia. So I'm going to push this off. We just cut off the bottom of that. I'm going to trace this notch, much as we did on the top of the rafter. I have a notch there. And if I try to push this away, it's not going to go because of this angle line. If there's angles or curved involved, then that push-pull tool doesn't work. So I am going to put in a couple lines. If I go down here, click on that end line, and then drag up in this direction, I'm holding down Shift to keep the line going, and it's not sticking. So I got to put a guideline in here. Just pick up any old vertical line. That's going to give me a point, which I don't want. I want a line. That's going to give me a point. Let's see. Let's pick up this vertical line. There I go. I've got a line instead of a point. I'm just going to click that into there. And I'm going to put another guideline on this point here. And all these things that I'm doing right now are inside of this group. So keep that in mind. We've got a bunch of scribbling going on there, but rather than click in and around and orbit around all this existing framing that we have in place, I'm just going to click out here, get out of that group edit mode. I'm selecting the group and then the move tool, touch the control key, and slide this out. Actually, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to take that group, right click it, and explode it. And now I'm going to take that, before I click anything else, I'm going to go make group. I want to, sorry about that. I'm going to go back another step till this is a group again. Okay, so now we have a group. Right clicking, explode it, right click again, and say make component, not make group. Okay. So I'm just going to call this rafter lesson. Now let's go hip rafter. Because I've already got another hip component in this model. I want to create a new one. So there we go. So we just changed our group to a component so that now when I select the component, our new component, the move tool, tap the control key and slide this over. Now I can do whatever I do to this model, it'll do it to the one that's more or less installed on the building. Makes it a little confusing with guidelines everywhere, but I think we can work around those. So now I'm going to jump into the component edit mode with a double click. And you can see how clean and easy this is now to take this bird's mouth out. I can just push it out of the way. I don't have to deal with any of that other geometry. And I think I can get rid of those two lines. I can get rid of that horizontal line. I can get rid of that horizontal line. I can get rid of this horizontal line. So we're cleaning everything up. And you can see that it's taking the guidelines out of that other hip component as well. So we'll go up here and trim off the top of this rafter. And you'll see there's no lines on the bottom or the other side, and I can pivot around and draw those lines in various ways, or what I suggest is, rather than draw lines, is to select and move them. So I'm just selecting a straight line, and the move tool, I'm just going to click it over here, and when the endpoints line up, I'm a happy guy. Now I take this little V, same thing, I select that little V by dragging around it, and I'm dragging left to right here, so I select everything that's within the square. If I draw right to left, it selects everything the square touches, which isn't what we want. This time I want to get just what I can draw around. So I've got those two little lines. Grab the move tool, hit Control, and then you can see I've got those little lines. I'm dragging them straight down till they line up with the end point at the bottom. And now I use right to left, delete the end of that, and then we'll just put our little vertical cut in here, which completes those two faces. Pretty slick way of doing it without drawing every line and without pivoting around here and trying to draw in and around these other framing members. Okay, so what we did on the top, we're going to follow a similar procedure on the bottom, because our guidelines are still intact from before. Oops, see if I can get this view in here. I'm going to pivot around underneath this and then put another guideline over here on this point. So because of the angled nature of this, the bottom of this rafter, I've got to go through the trouble of drawing these lines on there. I couldn't just move it like I did on the top, because the lines aren't, the line at the top of this and the line at the bottom are not the same. So that's the V I need, judging by those guidelines, which we can now erase. And let's see, I'll put them back in. And we need to draw these sidelines, which I'm just tracing. I could move that one over. This time I decided to just swing around and draw it in there. Okay, now we got what we need. See if I can get the model relined up here. Take out these guidelines. And then I'm just going to bulk erase this bottom by drawing right to left, clicking delete, and we have an open-ended hip rafter, which I'll fill in by just clicking the top and the bottom. And now we can click outside the edit mode. Oops, boy, I really got crazy there. And you can see everything we did to that component we did to this one. And that's the process for drawing a hip rafter. And I'm going to stop the video here with the hip rafter done, and I'll pick it up again from this point, and we'll draw those jack rafters, lest this video get senselessly long. So come back and watch the rest of this as we draw in the jack rafters for this model. And thanks for watching. I'll be back momentarily.